back with another episode. If you are watching on YouTube, you will notice that we actually have a camera hooked up this time. There's a reason for that, which I'll get to in a moment. I just want to say that those of you who feel the need to see the person that you're listening to, even though you're just listening and it's just talking and it's just information and nothing more, I think the people that feel the need to see what they're listening to, I think you're a little weird, need some help. But no, seriously, this is YouTube just gets more views. There's no question about that. Even my own numbers show that. And if we want to move forward with this podcast slowly but surely, we're going to have to get into this sort of thing eventually. And so the reason for the camera setup is more of like a test run. Okay, so don't get too excited. Doesn't mean every episode from now on is going to have a camera. This is a lot more annoying to go through than just hitting record and talking into a mic. So this is a test run because I have a special announcement. Marlon from the Gospel Truth channel, who always has all sorts of debates, he has invited me on to his show in late July for an open panel discussion on provisionism. So what he's been doing lately is been having, I think it's an awesome idea, he's been having open panel discussions where he brings on one or two people of a particular view to defend a view, and he brings on a couple people to ask questions and criticize the view. So he's had one on Arminianism and a couple other topics. I watched the one on Arminianism. I thought it was pretty cool, the format. So he asked me if I wanted to be on, and I basically said, well, I do, but what's the format? Because in my mind, I wanted to be sure that, I would have plenty of time to actually ask questions and, not just stand in line and just throw a question out there and then have to, bow out while they could either answer or not answer or sort of deflect my questions. I wanted to actually be in control of a lot of the time. I didn't say that. I just asked what's the format. So Marlon said, oh, well, you're going to be, it's going to be you and one other person asking questions for, a good first portion of the show. And then we'll bring in a couple other people after that. And I said, okay, well, that sounds cool. Oh, and why is this important? Well, guess who's going to be defending provisionism? Well, Leighton Flowers is. And one of his buddies, can't remember his name, Jordan. I think it's Jordan from, if you've been on Twitter, you've seen Jordan. He's got a Twitter account on there and posts a lot of stuff. So it's going to be Leighton and Jordan. And yeah, apparently I've been invited and I'm going to be able to ask Leighton Flowers a lot of questions, which is going to be real fun. Especially interested to see if he can, in the hot seat, try his best for a period of time to pretend Calvinism doesn't even exist and just answer questions from his own view. It's going to be very interesting to see if he can pull that off. But in this episode, I'm going to be going through a video that somebody on Twitter brought up. Keith Foskey, who is the if you're on Twitter, he's at Your Calvinist. He does a lot of, little comedy things, but he's also pastor. Super nice guy, super cool guy. Everybody from both sides seems to love him, and for good reason. So whatever you're doing, Keith, keep doing it the way you're doing it because it's working. This is way back a couple months ago at one of the James White debates, not the John 6 debate, but one of the ones he had before that. Leighton Flowers was there, and, before and after the debate, everybody sits down and does little podcasts and stuff. So Keith and Leighton are going to be doing an episode here, and they say, it's only about a half hour. It's very casual, but I think there's a lot of good points to be made. And one of my Twitter followers by the name of Josiah Huggins, let me get the actual Twitter handle on that guy. So his Twitter handle, if you want to give him a follow, I see him arguing a lot on Twitter, making very, very strong points from a Calvinist perspective. His Twitter handle is at Josiah Huggins with two G's, Huggins 1. At Josiah Huggins 1, if you want to give him a follow. He sent me a very long series of notes on this particular episode that he, just thought were good points and said, hey, maybe you want to make an episode here. And if you want to mention the points I've made, gladly will. We'll get to those points at a certain point in this episode, and I'll mention when we're going to bring those up. But there's also just a lot of really good stuff sort of to just cover here. So with that said, like I said, this is going to be a little different. If you're used to the podcast, there's a lot, you can't really hear it, but there's a lot of editing that goes on. So it sounds nice and smooth and flowing, and, in this format, it's going to be a little different, right? I'm probably going to be cutting in and out because I'm still going to edit it. This isn't live. but I'm hopefully going to be talking for longer periods of time, but I might have to edit it here and there. I might, if you're watching, might look like I'm doing the robot or whatever, cutting in and out. Again, that's you watching. You get what you deserve. The rest of you who are just listening, because there's no really other reason to be watching, it should sound okay. So with that said, please leave any comments regarding the video setup. I basically just ordered a green screen. I already had the camera. It's nothing overly special, but it is what it is, and it's what we're going to have at least for a while. I'll take any recommendations though. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in. So the first thing they'll be talking about is a little bit of the whole infant damnation issue. Again, not going to spend too much time on it, but it ties into what we'll be discussing here. I'm going to be playing the video at 1.25. So if you're playing the podcast at 1.5, it should still be okay.
In a public sphere that are hard, and we admit that, but it's not like they're not discussed and brought up by the scholars on both sides. There's quotes from Piper and others about the loss of infants and all kinds of other issues. In other words, theologians answer and talk about hard doctrines, and this is one of those. And in that context, Warren was making a comparison with a mindset, and this is the important word, is the mindset of pagan worshipers who are willing to worship a deity that would take their own child as a sacrifice. And it's the same mindset that's willing to worship that deity that would be willing to worship a deity that would damn their infant, or that would and the fact is,
now I to this day I cannot understand how that's the same mindset. Okay, how do you compare a mindset, again, of child sacrifice to a mindset that says, well, if total depravity were true, that we're all fallen sons and daughters of Adam, that we all deserve hell. Therefore, if God were to send children to hell, we might not like that, but it's not illogical or unjust, or there's no problem with it. How is that child sacrifice? I mean, again, I brought this up in the episodes I did on Belgate. If you're just trying to get across that we're accepting a hard truth, you could do that with almost anything. Why do you need to bring up child sacrifice? How is that the same mindset? It's not the same mindset at all. And in fact, I have to bring it up again because the provisionist perspective guys, when they sort of respond in my episode, they avoided the question or the example that I gave, which I believe to be a one-to-one parallel. So they've ignored it. I have yet to get an answer from them. Maybe if Leighton Flowers hears this, he'll be willing to give me an answer to bringing up this idea of child sacrifice. So let's flip this back on you. If I were to say that provisionists have a mindset of child sacrifice because you believe that God allows children to get cancer, he allows it, and you have a spirit of child sacrifice because you would believe that if your child got cancer, that God allowed that, and you're cool with it, and it's okay because at least you don't have cancer. Now that should just cause your head to explode in terms of absurdity, offensiveness, that I would insinuate that you have the same mindset as a pagan child sacrificer, right? Because you believe that, well, yeah, God let my child get cancer, but at least it wasn't me. At least I didn't get cancer. How is that not a direct one-to-one to what Warren put forth when he said, I'm cool with my children, I'm cool with sacrificing my children as long as I get my crops, and Calvinists are cool with their children going to hell as long as they get into heaven. It's a direct one-to-one. So my challenge to you is, how do you address what I just said, the whole child cancer thing? How do you not have a mindset of child sacrifice? And here's the point. Any answer that you give to why the example I just gave is not in any way a valid example, and why you don't have a mindset or a spirit of child sacrifice, any answer you give is an answer I could give to why Calvinists don't have a mindset of child sacrifice either, right? So I very much look forward to somebody to give a response to show what's the difference. What's the difference between what Warren said and what I just said? I just made it up as an example to point out and prove the absurdity of this. For you to say, well, you have a spirit of child sacrifice because if your child got cancer, your mindset would be, well, at least it wasn't me. Okay? And again, if your claim is that that was not Warren's intent, that he did not intend to have this selfish, uncaring, well, at least it wasn't me attitude, even though those were his original words, well, then if all you're trying to get across, again, is that we accept hard truths, you accept a hard truth that God let your child get cancer, right? It's horrible, it's terrible, and we don't really want to talk about it much. Yeah, but okay, you accept a hard truth. What does that have to do with sacrificing kids? I just don't get it.
Most Calvinists don't believe, at least the most mainstream Calvinists that I'm aware of, don't believe that God damns infants to hell. And
now, thank you for saying that. And it's true. Like, nobody says that. All we're saying, I mean, we all hope they all go to heaven, right? Nobody wants them in hell, right? All we're saying is that if there are any there, then God has justification for them being there, and he's not unjust. That's all we're saying.
that was stated not only in the context of that conversation, but by Warren and others in other conversations, playing John MacArthur actually defending the fact that God saves all infants. And so, taken out of context and played in the way it was, and plus my little section was clipped out right after Warren's comment. I said, well, any good parent is obviously going to love their child. I said that was my very first words, and then it clipped.
And why would you have had to say that immediately? Maybe it's because of the way Warren came across. You needed to really correct that and set things straight, right?
To the next section, and where I said, I can't imagine, believing in reprobation and thinking, that my God might do that to one of my children. I can't even fathom. That's incomprehensible to me. Inconceivable was a word that James White had used back in 1987, describing that. He says it's inconceivable that God would punish an innocent infant. He's changed his view since.
Did he say
punish an innocent infant?
Punish an innocent infant. You see, here's the problem, Leighton. I don't know why you missed this part. You're talking about how horrible it is and terrible it is and inconceivable it is. Guess what? If we believed that our children were innocent before God, like you just said, accidentally maybe said, that they're innocent before God, if we believed that, then we would find it just as inconceivable as you, right? We would find it just as absurd and blasphemous that God would send anybody, whether it's an infant or an adult, an innocent person to hell, right? There's just one problem. We don't believe that they're innocent.
He's changed.
So what's my point here? My point here is the assumption that you're taking your own view about people being innocent, concluding that God would be terrible, and then you're projecting that onto the Calvinists and saying, well, some of them just suck it up and just assume that God's terrible or that they just have to deal with it. It's like, no. Just you skipped the part where we don't believe children are innocent. And if they're not, then yeah, we might think it's terrible and not like it that our child would end up there in hell. But it's not unjust because they're not innocent. So it's not inconceivable.
Which is view since then, toward the view he represented in the talkback just now.
And by the way, one of the things I wanted to point out as I was listening to this before it popped into my head, why does your emotional explosions stop at innocent children or just the idea of children, right? Why does it stop there? Why can't we move on to the little old lady who lived a mostly good life? Outwardly to us, she just seemed like a wonderful person, and oh, she's in hell. Why don't your emotional explosions cause you to find that to be inconceivable? What about children who have reached your magical age of accountability, which we're going to get into in a little bit here? And maybe they're 10 years old, so they're past the age of accountability, but they've lived, they've had good parents, they were raised well. Is it inconceivable that they've sinned and that they go to hell? Or is it okay for 10-year-olds sinners to be in hell? Like, at the end of the day, guys, it's just, I really don't like emotional arguments. And I know Leighton's not intending to sort of sit there and be like on some sort of pedestal in terms of moral superiority here. Like, oh, I just can't accept that. And if you can, then I don't think that's what he's intending. But that is what comes across to a lot of us when these types of emotional arguments are made.
I really do believe the Bible is abundantly clear about God's feelings towards infants and children. And I think there are way too many passages, I think at least as many passages that support such strong doctrines as the doctrine of the Trinity and other things to show us and to tell us what God will do for those infants or imbeciles as they're referred to.
Now, he's on the, this is just a little live thing. He's on the spot. He doesn't have those verses, and that's fine. But we'll cover a lot of those verses in future episodes. My guess would be that a lot of those verses would be from Jesus' standpoint. And here's my problem. When I start to try to articulate this, you got to hear me out and try to really understand what I'm getting at here. A lot of people like to quote things Jesus says and attitudes that he might have towards other people, or in this case, children, and then take that and say, since he's God, therefore we project that onto God in general. Okay? Can you or can't you do that? I don't know if there's a straight answer to that question, but here's my point. Jesus entered creation, and he was a human being. Okay? So he experienced all sorts of things that, as a human being, that we can't just immediately project onto God. So in the same way that you or I might love our neighbor, this goes into the whole, well, does God love everybody or not? Again, I need to do an episode on common grace, blah, blah, blah. I would just cut it down the center, because when we're talking about God, it's not this human emotion of love and hatred. It's more of a disposition he has towards the people, and why he's creating them in the ways that he does, and the plans and purposes he has in their lives, to be summed up and described as quote unquote love or quote unquote hatred. So I would say that God loves the elect and hates the reprobate. And that's summarized in their eternal destinies, plans and purposes he has for them, etc. So to take Jesus saying, I don't know exact quotes or verses, but the point is to take an attitude of love that Jesus has towards a fellow human being, while he's a human being, and say, well, therefore, since he's God, God must also, love that person. I think it's taking a humanistic, it's a valid emotion that we might have, or a disposition that we as humans might have towards one another. But to take that and project it onto God is my point here, that I think a lot of people do. And so I'm saying all this to say, my guess is that he's saying, there's all these verses in the Bible where it's just so clear that children end up in heaven. My guess is that he's going to be quoting Jesus talking with regards to children. And again, our children are innocent before us, human to human, right? That doesn't mean they're innocent between, toward God vertically. They can be innocent horizontally, doesn't mean they're innocent vertically. And by the way, that reminds me, on one of our Twitter Fun episodes, again, this is just me guessing because he doesn't bring up the verses here, but I remember Leighton quoting a verse in the Old Testament where God basically said, you killed your innocent children. And he says, see, children are innocent. No, they killed the children that were innocent before them. That's why they're guilty of murder, because murder is killing innocent life, taking innocent life. And that's why they're guilty for it, right? But that's murder for anybody. I can murder an adult who's innocent before me, and it's murder on my part because they were innocent before me. That doesn't mean they're innocent before God. We don't get to conflate these relationships. Long story short, that's a squirrel I just saw off to the side there.
Mental incompetence, something like that. We believe that they will be saved. And I think MacArthur uses a lot of those same scriptures when he makes a case for this. Piper uses a lot of the same.
Did he say they will be saved? If I remember correctly, the Your Calvinist guy here is going to sort of catch him on that. If they're innocent, why do they need to be saved? Innocent children? Saved from what? There's no sin. They're innocent. Anyways.
And I'm not talking about one or two verses.
No, but I'm familiar with
Andrew mentioned David, the David passage. But there are literally dozens of passages that are referenced in defense of the fact that God does not damn infants. That it's not the reason. It's really.
See, and I find that hard to believe. I don't think there are dozens and dozens of passages that say, or even explicitly hint at God not damning infants. I don't think it's that explicit.
To me, it's baffling that White says we can't know that. It seems to me a lot stronger in Scripture, even from many reformers, Christian reformers. And I was surprised nobody on the stage took that position. I thought Michael would probably take that position. Is it Michael or Nathan?
No, Michael's Michael Schultz. Yeah.
I thought Michael Schultz would step in and take that position because I just assumed, based upon some of the things that I've heard him say, that he would take that position. But I understand if you.
And this is just something that's passing through my mind right now. The idea of, well, God wouldn't ever punish an infant, or I think they're about to get into, well, what about death, pain, suffering? I just mentioned earlier child cancer, a lot of pain and suffering involved there. What about all the passages in the Bible where it explicitly says, not that God just lets somebody get cancer, but that God actually kills a bunch of people, including children, like, for example, in the flood, or in the account of Pharaoh and the plagues, kills the firstborn of Egypt, boils, sicknesses, disease, pain, suffering. God actually inflicts these things on them. How do you reconcile that with God doing that to innocent children. In other words, you're so emotionally erupting over, I could never believe that God would do these sorts of things, pain, suffering, etc., in hell, but I'm perfectly okay with God doing pain, suffering, etc., sickness, disease, in time while they're here on earth. That's cool. They're innocent. God's doing it to them here. That's cool. But as soon as we cross over into hell and damnation, whoa, all of a sudden, we can't have God doing that sort of stuff to innocent children. I'd like an answer to that sort of question.
You just kind of let it go because you don't want to get into a controversy on a stage, or if he holds to that position, I don't know.
I think there are a lot of difficulties here, and if you would allow for a little bit of not necessarily pushback, just thoughts, right, on this issue.
Of course.
Because one of the first things that sort of was a controversy at my church when I was preaching Calvinism or whatever was that I believe babies go to hell, and I've never preached that, and it was not something that I'd ever said, but it was a generic attack against Calvinism that all Calvinists believe babies go to hell, and you have affirmed already, but I'm going to ask you again to simply say you know that not all Calvinists believe.
I know that for a fact. Matter of fact, I've celebrated that fact.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
and I know
many times online and played videos of.
John MacArthur's
video, he even says they're innocent, for goodness sake.
Well, the book.
Right, so that's great, and Leighton celebrates the fact that most Calvinists probably do claim that all children end up in heaven. Now, he didn't say it here, but I'm pretty sure later on he's gonna do what a lot of people have done, and really irritates me, and that is to basically say, "Oh, thank goodness, so many Calvinists have chosen to be inconsistent with their Calvinism and believe that all children go to heaven." I mentioned this in my episodes on Ballgate, and I'll say it again because it's very, very important that people understand that when people try to pull that, you don't let them do it. You don't fall for it. Okay, there is absolutely nothing inconsistent about a Calvinist believing that all children end up in heaven. Okay. You have total depravity being true, and you have unconditional election being true. Okay? Both of those things being true in no way necessitates that even a single child end up in hell. And that's because election is unconditional, right? So, just because total depravity says that we're all fallen sons and daughters of Adam, we all deserve hell, doesn't mean that God must send anybody to hell. It's a choice that he makes. He could choose to save everyone, or in this case, could choose to save all infants, because that election is unconditional, right? Now, this brings up an interesting point, and I want people to be aware of an argument that they might try to pull when you mention that. And they might say, no, not so fast. It is inconsistent, and here's why. They'll say, if God is saving children because they're dying as children, then that is a condition that he is basing his choice to save them upon, right? And therefore, you're stuck. And so what I want to do is take a minute to answer that and have you guys well equipped to answer that particular question. And what this comes down to is properly understanding unconditional election from the start. Okay? I think this was episode 3 of this podcast, like 3 years ago. Unconditional election, properly understood, is you have to think of God as the divine author, right? So let's pretend we're going to be an author for a moment. Erase everything. There's just you, right? And you're going to think up your characters, and you're going to plan your characters, right? You're going to create your characters. You are going to be actively determining and planning everything about them. In other words, you're not looking over at a bunch of characters that were determined or created by something else or someone else and going, well, you know what? I sort of need a character that does this, so he fits it best. I'll take that guy, and I'll take him and use him as a character. That would be conditional choice, conditional election. That would be you looking at a pool of characters that you have nothing to do with and choosing ones that best fit your needs. That's conditional, right? Unconditional election, or in this case of the story, unconditional character creation, is active. It is you starting with nothing, just you, and saying, I need a character that does this, so I'm going to create a character that does this, or has this, or is this, etc., etc. So you notice the big difference there between what's going on. So when you take that concept and bring it back to the idea of election is far more than just God choosing who I'm going to save, who he's going to save. And election includes, it's the eternal decree, but it includes salvation, which happens in time, but it also, and that's the ultimate, But it also includes everything that leads up. It includes the entire life of the person. There's much more to the idea of election and what it entails for the life of a person than just, well, they'll be saved someday. That's my point. And it goes for both sides of the coin, right? Reprobation is also an active choice on God's part, not a reactive one, right? And yet reprobation includes more than just the ultimate destiny of damnation, right? It includes all sorts of purposes God might have in that person's existence along the way, okay? So as an example, take Charles Spurgeon, wonderful Christian, did a whole lot for God. God did not choose to save him because of all the things he saw Charles Spurgeon would do for him. God chose to save Charles Spurgeon so that he could use him in the ways that he did all along the way. And I hope you can see how that fits the active character creation, active election, which is, by definition, and must be logically unconditional, over against a conditional election, which is, unfortunately, the reason I take the time to try to explain this is a lot of Calvinists, they don't properly explain it. God is not looking at a pool of people that he didn't have anything to do with and then choosing who to elect. God is electing and reprobating in terms of eternal purposes, ultimate purposes, and then creating and having things flow out from that so that those ends are achieved. And another squirrel that just flew by here real quick is do not confuse salvation and election. Do not confuse damnation and reprobation. Okay? Election is the eternal decree. Salvation is the temporal outplay of the eternal decree. Salvation happens in time. Election happens in eternity past. Same thing with damnation. One of the episodes I'm going to review next is Leighton Flowers reviewing some Calvinist talking to an atheist lady. Blah, blah, blah. It's going to provide some good content. Let's put it that way. But one of the things Leighton did in that video is try to present the idea that God is unjust in Calvinism because he is reprobating unconditionally. And therefore he is damning people who basically are innocent and don't deserve it. Because he's conflating reprobation, which is unconditional, with damnation, which is conditional. Okay? Salvation and damnation happen in time. They're conditional. Salvation is conditioned on faith. Damnation is conditioned on sin. Right? Punishment is conditioned on sin. But election and reprobation are unconditional. So that was a very long rabbit trail there.
And not even from a position of necessarily predestination and election, more so on the issue of like in the Lutheran, as you know, I've been studying Lutheranism recently because I want to understand it better, not because I want to become a Lutheran.
I could save you a lot of time and a lot of study on Lutheranism. Just remember, it's a mystery. And I'm being halfway sarcastic there.
You're Lutheran. No, not because of that. Because I really do. I respect a lot of people. Dr. Jordan B. Cooper has become just a guy I really respect. I think a lot of him as a person. Yeah. I think he's a good teacher, and so I want to know why he believes what he believes.
Right.
I'm interested in that. And I know there are beliefs that like God, like in baptism, such as some believe in infant baptism, there's the imparting of faith. Because they would say justification is by faith alone. Therefore, if a baby is saved, it's because they have faith. Therefore, there has to be this impartation of faith. And if I'm misrepresenting anybody's position, I'm not trying.
That reminds me. Another question I'd like an answer to. I just mentioned the whole unconditional election, why it's not inconsistent for Calvinists to believe that all children end up in heaven. God is not saving them. God is not saving children because they're dying as children. Rather, God is determining that they will die as children so that he can save them. Right? I should have said that back when I was trying to explain it. It just popped into my head. Let me say it again. God is not saving children because they are dying as children. God is determined that they will die as children so that he can save them. And by the way, again, there's more to it than just that. That's the ultimate, yay, they get to be in heaven end goal, right? But even people who have lost children, God is, determined that will occur for the purpose of bringing all sorts of things, bringing them closer and more reliant upon God, for example. That's the most obvious one I could think of. Haven't lost a child, don't have a child. But I'm just trying to imagine the plans and purposes that God would have in doing that. Okay? Again, speaking as a Calvinist. So God is not saving children because they're going, if we're going to believe it, God is not saving children because they're dying as children. God has determined that they will die as children so that he could save them. That's one of his purposes.
I'm saying I've heard that been said. So,
in the same way, Spurgeon, God did not choose to save Spurgeon because all the things he would do if he saved him. God chose to save Spurgeon so that he would do all the things he would do when he saved them.
So there has been in the historic church this debate, and it's so I don't as as fair as I want to be in saying, I agree with you, there's a lot of passages that I think we could point to. Jesus said, let the little children come unto me, and for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Obviously, these passages have to mean something, right, in regard to this issue. I do think it's fair
And we will cover those passages in the future.
to say that godly men have wrestled with this, because in the flood, there were babies in the flood. There were babies in Sodom, we assume. I mean, we talk, maybe there were homosexuals. There weren't any babies at that point. But in general, we would say that there have been instances such as in the Psalms where it talks about dashing the head of the child against a rock. This is a terrible thing to have to talk about. But we do have to address the fact that there have been instances where it seems as if that God's wrath has fallen upon all, including children.
Well, the ending of a temporary life is, of course, quite a bit significantly different than an eternal, suffering in hell.
So why? I mentioned this earlier because I remembered hearing it, and here it is. Why is that different? Why is it different that God inflicts pain, suffering, and death on children in this life? That's okay, but he can't inflict pain, suffering, etc. in hell. Why? What's the difference? Well, the time. Principally, why does it? I don't see why time changes anything. Whether it's a year of pain here or 20 years of pain there, the principle that God is inflicting pain on an innocent person still needs to be addressed by you, Leighton.
Oh, and that gets to the other question of what does that look like? And so when you're talking about infant damnation, or even questioning whether or not God would save an infant who perishes or an aborted baby, and Dr. White pretty clear that he does not hold to the view that MacArthur holds to. So
if you notice, he's not answering the question. Why is God just in doing all those terrible things to children? It's not just God. You can't just say God lets it happen. The Bible says far more than that. God is involved in these things. He does them to even children, kills them, sickness, disease. And he's not answering the question. He's just ignoring it.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
And
which to me, I mean, I disagree with Calvinism, but that form of Calvinism seems far less offensive, at least in my eyes, and it doesn't bring near as much question on the character and goodness of God. If, heaven forbid, MacArthur and Piper as the influential...
Again, if children are not innocent, which would be our position, then it doesn't question God's character at all. All it does is question your emotions, threaten your emotions. It doesn't bring anything against his character or his justice or anything like that, right? It's only if they were innocent, like you say. Well, then, if we believed that, we'd probably be on your side of this whole thing.
As they are, we're taking a position that God might or might not save infants. I think that's so devastating to the church to even paint that kind of a picture of God.
Again, why do they need to be saved?
To me, it's just...
Saved? Innocent people being saved from what?
It is an inconceivable concept to me. Okay. And so that's why I think I'm so passionate about just defending what I believe is the character of God with regard to...
And he says it's an inconceivable concept. Again, why is this limited to just that? Why don't your emotions boil over into other areas? Okay? God might have given you a child that he knew with certainty would grow into adulthood, spend their entire lives rejecting him, and end up in hell. God gave you that child. It's still your child, whether it's an adult or not. It's your child that he gave to you. You love that child, right? You want to see, even when they're an adult, you want to see them in heaven because they're your child. You love them probably more than the average other person walking around you because they're your child. So why isn't that inconceivable? That God would give you a child that he certainly knew would end up in hell, growing to an adult, image accountability, whatever, and ends up in hell. Why isn't that inconceivable? Right? And my only guess is you take your free will magic wand, and when this question or any questions like it come along, you just wave that. Free will magic wand, right? That is not an answer to this question, okay? You don't just get to say, well, yeah, he knew that they would end up there, but it's because of their free will ultimately. I do want to take the time to stop here and explain why that's not the case, okay? God is in the ultimate position. He is the one who is creating people when, where, and how he does. That includes your children, okay? So if we just strip everything away and talk hypothetically about one person, let's just put it on me. God could create me in a million different ways. A million different parents, a million different genetics, a million different times, places, lives, trillions of different decisions in different lives that I would be making, right? And yet, whose choice is it, ultimately, which life I get? The answer is God. God is ultimately choosing. So you can talk all day long about all the quote-unquote free will choices I make in each life, but it's not my free will that determines which life I get. So you're going to point out all these, look at all these things that are up to you. But it wasn't up to me that those things be up to me. And in fact, God's knowledge of my existence of each of those millions of lives only exists in his mind because he considered creating me in those ways. God wouldn't know anything about me in any life if he didn't stop and consider, if I create Colin in this way, he will do this, that, and the other, and end up here, right? So here's my point. You don't get to wave the free will magic wand and call it a day. You still have God in the ultimate position. And I just want to know, why is it that is not an excuse? Leighton always likes to talk about, well, if Calvinism were true, man would have an excuse, because on Judgment Day they could say, God, I only did what you determined me to do, so why are you judging me? Pretend Calvinism doesn't exist and take what I just said about all the millions of different lives, God knows this and that and the other. Why doesn't the same excuse apply for me? I could stand before God and say, God, yeah, I did all those things, but I didn't choose to exist in that way, doing those things. In fact, God, you had the choice, ultimately, to create me in one way where I end up in heaven, or in this way where I end up in hell standing before you now. And you, without checking with me and asking me, you chose to create me in the way I end up in hell rather than the way I end up in heaven. So why are you judging me? Why is any of it my fault? It's the exact same objection that you raise against Calvinists, just flip back on you. And the reason you can't, just wave your free will magic wand is because every time you do that, you're ignoring that God is in the ultimate position. God is in ultimate control of these things. You can talk all day long about the free will in creation. You're not addressing God's choice to create people in specific ways. Okay? And in fact, that reminds me of an argument I've heard in the upper circles, listening to people like Tyler Vela or Colton Carlson interacting with Braxton Hunter, who's a Molinist, and trying to demonstrate why free will is not an answer to really anything when you start breaking it down and showing the person who's in the ultimate position. So there's an analogy or an argument or an example, however you want to phrase it, called a bullet bill example. And so if we talk, for example, obviously if I take a gun and I shoot somebody, I'm guilty, right? But let's imagine for a moment that I have a gun and I'm going to shoot at an animal because I need to kill it because I need to eat, right? Whether or not you would argue with that being right or wrong is not the point. If you want to bring the animals out of it, I'm just over at the shooting range practicing my aiming. So I go and I fire a gun, but what comes out is a bullet bill, a little bullet that has free will. And instead of going into my target, he decides, you know what, I'm going to hang a left straight into someone's face. That's what the bullet with its free will decides to do. Now, the question is, am I guilty and responsible, morally responsible, for the result of what that bullet did, since I'm the one that pulled the trigger? Now, I've thought about it, and there's obviously two, but I've thought about it, I think there's really three when you bring the whole ultimate open theist theological circus into this picture. But let's start with the first one. Well, it comes down to knowledge, right? Did I know that when I fired the gun, that the bullet would decide to take a left turn and go into someone's face? Did I know that? If I had absolutely no clue that was going to happen, well, then I wouldn't be guilty, right? I don't think anybody would argue that I would be, because I'd be ignorant of that, right? In fact, not just ignorant of that, but that's the first example. And the second example introduces what I like to call dynamic ignorance, or maybe dynamic negligence. I think dynamic negligence is a better term, as you'll see. And that's a play on their whole dynamic omniscience term. Dynamic negligence is option number 2, and that is, I knew that I'd be firing a bullet bill because I'm the creator of the gun and I'm the creator of the bullet bill. I'm giving it free will. I knew that I'd be firing it, and I knew all the possibilities of what the bullet bill could do, but I don't know what it would actually do. So I choose to be negligent. I would argue they would deny that. I would say I choose to be negligent, and knowing all the risks, still fire that bullet bill. Would I be guilty? Now, the open theist would say no. And I would say absolutely, because of negligence, right? You knew the possibilities, and you did it anyways. Anyways, that's option 2, or maybe 1.5. But let's stick with the main options. Let's take the three-ring circus, open theism, theological circus out, and let's bring in just the mainstream. You either didn't know it or you know it. If I knew that by pulling that trigger exactly what that bullet bill would do, maybe it would hang a left into someone's face and then go through them and a right into another person's face, and I become a mass murderer as a result. I knew it was all going to happen, and I choose to pull the trigger anyways. Does it matter one bit that that bullet had free will? No, it doesn't. Not even a little bit. Because ultimately, I'm the one that pulled the trigger, knowing what would happen. Okay? So, I think that's an excellent argument and example to take it back and point out why the free will magic wand, when I ask Leighton Flowers, why don't I have an excuse on the day of judgment, or bring it even more back to what I was pointing out, God gives you a child that he knows will certainly do nothing but reject him and end up in hell, and he gives you that child anyways. Why aren't you outraged over that? Why aren't you emotionally just, I could never believe in a God that would give me a child destined for hell type of deal? You can't wave that free will magic wand because it's the bullet bill example just applied there. God pulled the trigger, so to speak. He gave you that child that he knew would certainly use their free will to do X, Y, and Z and end up in hell. He's still in the ultimate position. Okay? Free will magic wand doesn't do anything except make you feel better about it. Doesn't answer anything for the rest of us.
I think MacArthur's right. I think Piper's right. I think the dozens upon dozens of verses clearly demonstrate that God would show mercy and grace to infants that perish.
Matt, again, and trust me, I'm not trying to argue terrible thing.
You can, absolutely.
But no, I'm not.
So I think this is where he's about to get back at him for, he just said that children need mercy and grace. Well, that's interesting. It's a little awkward.
I'm not trying to, because I don't want anyone to assume I'm arguing for the infants going to hell. That's not my point. But you just used the phrase, and again, if you lisped and you didn't mean to say it, I don't want to simply, I got you.
Right.
I'm not that guy.
Awkward.
But you said God extends mercy. If they're innocent, why do they need mercy?
Well, because they're still born outside the garden.
So, nuclear bomb question, right? His answer is they're still born outside the garden. Why? Why is an innocent person born outside the garden? I haven't heard Leighton provide an answer to that one yet.
And so they're still under the corruption of the world. The analogy that I know Dr. Adam Harwood has used, matter of fact.
Now, this is where I need to introduce one of my Twitter followers, Josiah Huggins. I hope I pronounced his name right. But he messaged me a nice, long, detailed notes on, he had listened to this. He's the one who brought this video to my attention. And I have to give him credit for some of the points that he made. First of all, you're going to notice something. Does Leighton actually answer the question, why do infants need mercy? Right? And saying because they're outside the garden, it's not an answer. Right? What Josiah Huggins, one of my Twitter followers, pointed out is that mercy is it's withholding what we deserve. So we deserve punishment. God withholds it, and that's mercy. No, so mercy and grace they're related, but they're not directly. Grace is getting what you don't deserve. Mercy is not getting what you do deserve. Basically, we've all heard that, right? So why is it then? How is that an answer? When we ask you, why do infants need mercy, which is, why do infants need to have withheld from them what they deserve? You answer with, well, because they're born separated from him. Well, God's not withholding that. He's creating them separated from him. He's not withholding pain and suffering from them. He's doing those things to them. These innocent children, right? Death, etc. He's not withholding any of that from them. That would be mercy, right? So this is not an answer, right? If they're innocent, then there's nothing God can hold against them in the first place, and therefore there's no need for mercy, right?
It's Millard Erickson, Zwingli, even Dr. White mentioned Zwingli, which is a view of the corruption of the heart, where I was getting a distraction because somebody was messaging me from behind you there, but where, for example, an example of it would be like a baby that's born addicted to crack cocaine. They're called crack babies in the ER. The baby is obvious.
Now, this is a little weird when I heard this.
Greatly affected by the sins of her addicted mother, but the baby's not guilty for what the mother has done. The baby's just affected by what the mother has done.
Okay, so really quickly, and so my Josiah pointed out that the whole crack baby thing, it's not that they were born addicted because the mother was addicted. It's that by doing the drugs, the mother did all sorts of damage to the child. And that's how, like, when I heard that, I was a little confused too, because, when I was a kid, it wasn't thrown around a lot, but everybody understood that if you used it as an insult, it just basically meant you were calling someone stupid, right? Crack baby. Or you were insulting their parents as being drug addicts. But the point is that the drugs did damage to the child, right? So it's not that they were born addicted. I don't know where he got that. As Josiah points out, that's not the case. But anyways, the point he's trying to make is that he's sort of likening this, the effects of the parents, right? But he's not held responsible for the effects of the parents, is what he's trying to get at. And again, we covered in past episodes that provisionists will like to say that we inherit a nature inclined towards sin. And I think he's trying to use this crack baby analogy where the baby is born inclined towards crack because the mother was. Let's hear this out.
In the same way, a child that's born outside the garden under the curse of sin is greatly affected and impacted under the corruption, where they are certainly going to grow up in sin because of their nature, their desires, and the corrupt fallen world that they grow up in.
Okay, so there's that one sentence I could go on for an hour on the problems with it. But so he's trying to say that we all have a nature inclined towards sin. And the problem with that is, number one, that is a condition, right, Leighton? You like to talk about Calvinism's terrible because God creates you in a condition that's beyond your control. Wouldn't that just fit the definition that you just gave perfectly? That we inherit a nature inclined towards sin. God creates us with a nature inclined towards sin. God creates us in a condition whereby we will certainly sin. You just heard him say that. They will certainly grow up and certainly sin. And I think their statement of faith even says that. Everyone capable, that's right, I remember. Everyone capable of moral action will sin. Right? That's how they explain the fact that there's never been a sinless person. Good luck reconciling that with free will, by the way. They'll talk about that a little bit towards the end of this episode. But how is that fair, Leighton? How is it fair that God creates me in a condition whereby I will certainly sin and be at risk for eternal judgment? How's that fair? Like, it's amazing to me that you have such an issue with total depravity. It's so horrible. God creates you in a fallen condition, where you can only ever sin willingly and freely, by the way, because you want to. But until God changes your heart, that's just terrible. But you're okay with God creating you in a condition beyond your control whereby you will certainly sin when you hit a certain age? Like, it's the same thing, dude. It's the same thing. You're just introducing like a time buffer where people are innocent for a while. But when you're admitting that there's something about their nature that is going to determinatively result, you don't like that word, but it's going to result in them sinning, surely sinning, as you just admitted, you're not solving the problem. You've got the same quote-unquote fairness problem that you have argued against us Calvinists from the start.
But that doesn't mean that you have to hold to this concept of inherited guilt, that we are born guilty for the sins of our parents. I think there's passages out of Ezekiel, I don't have all in front of me, passages out of Ezekiel that we're not held guilty for the sins of our parents, and other passages that seem to indicate, to me at least, and to Zwingli and even other reformers, Miller Dixon and others, that don't necessarily teach the doctrine of inherited guilt. Now that's where with Dr. White's view that abortion would be the greatest heaven-filling device. What's the alternative? That abortion's the greatest filling of hell device? I mean, you see what I'm saying?
Well, James White's point was that that's why we should combat it. Because if it can send children to hell, then we should fight against it. Like, it's just, I thought that was obvious.
Or maybe half heaven, half hell, or 60% heaven and 40% hell, or 10%. I mean, it just seems to me, why I don't understand why a Calvinist would even take that option when there's such a overwhelming mainstream.
Oh, by the way, forgot to mention, nature inclined towards sin. Why does God need to create us that way anyways? I mean, you've got such a problem with this idea of nature being passed down, problems with nature being inherited by, passed down to the children of Adam. You're trying to sort of hold on to it because the Bible teaches it, but you've got such clear problems with it that you want to maintain innocence and blah, blah, blah. Why not? Like, why does God need to create us with a nature inclined towards sin? Why does God need to create us if we're innocent? Why does he need to create us separated from him? Why not just create new, fresh, clean slates? Like, what's the answer to that question? Why does God have to? Obviously, he's chosen to do it this way. But my point is, it's almost like you're speaking of something that's outside of God's control. Like, oh darn, Adam sinned, and now everybody I create from this point forward is just going to have this nature inclined towards sin. Like, I don't know. It just doesn't, questions after questions.
Calvinistic defense of infant salvation. The only reason that I can fathom, I can't psychologize James White or others that hold that view, but the only reason I can think of that they would hold to that is that it's the only thing they see as truly consistent with their doctrine of inherited guilt.
And there you have it. See, they think the reason we might accept or understand that there might be children in hell, or if there are, that it would be okay, is because it's the only we're trying to be consistent with our views. I've already addressed that, right? There's nothing inconsistent about it, about every single child going to heaven in Calvinism. In fact, I would argue, and I'll bring it up now, forgot to mention earlier, we're the only ones who actually have a basis for children exercising faith in the first place. So I have another question for Leighton. You're all about free will, and isn't salvation, like, by definition, a moral choice? Like, let me rephrase that. Salvation is by definition a relationship with God, and so it involves a moral choice of believing in God and accepting God with your free will, right? So how is God saving innocent children apart from their free will? Where does their free will come into the picture, right? How do you work that in there? And how is that fair? God's not supposed to force himself on anybody, right? How many times do we hear that God is, I don't even want to get into some of the way people have phrased that. You know what I'm hinting at. But, well, if he's not checking with you first and he's just saving you, well, that's like divine rape, I've heard some people say, absurdly. Well, why isn't that the case with innocent children? Is God checking with them? Hey, would you like to be saved? Where's free will in this picture? Never heard Leighton address that issue.
And I think that's just a huge sacrifice to make to hold that doctrine.
So at the end of the day, we're the ones who actually have a basis, Calvinists, for believing that children can be saved and saved through faith and a decision to trust in Christ, because we believe that God can actually change a person's heart, even the heart of a child or an infant. We believe that. You have a serious problem with God determining free will choices, so to speak. God determining the choices of people, God changing people's hearts miraculously so that they will do something. You've got a problem with that. And so you're going to have a problem reconciling how God is saving innocent children apart from their free will. Good luck with that one.
Again, that's my argument. And I understand that a person wants to be consistent with the claims of their system. But if that is at the sacrifice of the character of God, I just think treads so lightly, brothers, that you would in any way insinuate something so horrendous and inconceivable as that our God would damn an aborted baby to eternal hell. That's just,
Again, for the third time, it's only horrible and inconceivable if they were innocent, right? If we believed that they were, then we'd be right along your lines of, oh, the horror, oh, the inconceivability. But we don't believe they're innocent, okay? Again, it doesn't mean that we have to like it. Nobody wants to talk about it, but there's nothing inconsistent about it. And, another thing is this emotion, I could just never accept that God would do that. It's been used by everyone under the sun to even deny Christianity as a whole throughout history. So you're making the type of argument that anybody has made. It's not a Calvinism thing, right? Why would God allow my child to get cancer? Could never accept that. Why would God take my child from me in a miscarriage? Could never accept that. Like, just on and on and on. Why would God allow this or allow that or do this or do that? It's like people have rejected Christianity in general as a whole because of those emotional reasons. So this is nothing special or unique to Calvinism when it comes to this heightened level of emotion.
And so Keith's not bringing that.
And that's why I think it holds no weight, literally zero weight. Everybody thinks it's a huge deal. I don't think it's a big deal at all when it comes to what's true and false in terms of this debate. It has no weight to it in this Calvinism versus non-Calvinism, provisionism, whatever debate.
To be contingent.
No, I'm not a shock jock. I'm not Howard Stern of Calvinism.
You're much too gracious, if anything.
Well, and I hope that people aren't hearing my pushback as this is necessarily a position that I take or anything. I'm simply saying here are the things, here are the issues, and I do think that this is an issue that has in some way been debated within the church because of the questions of how much sin is inherited, how much guilt is inherited. As you said, if the need for grace and mercy is there, then there still has to be an act of salvation on God's part of some sense, in some way, when a child
being
dies.
saved from death. I mean, death is a curse of the fall. And so every baby's going to eventually die, whether they die as infants or 80-year-olds are going to die.
Why are innocent people being cursed? It's a curse of the fall? Why are innocent children being cursed by death and pain and suffering? We still have yet to have an answer from Leighton, right? If you're going to, he would have to just paint them as victims, basically, right? Is that his answer? I'm just trying to guess. Well, they live in a sinful world, and so poor them, they're just victims of death and pain and suffering. But again, you haven't answered the question why God remains just in allowing those things to happen to innocent people. And again, not just allowing, as I mentioned, the Bible all over the place has God inflicting these things on them.
But so they're being saved from that as well. And so salvation.
And it's like, so it almost brings you to tears. And I'm saying this respectfully, not sarcastically right now. It almost brings you to tears at the point you want to move on topics that God might send a child to hell. But it doesn't bring you to tears that he would give a child cancer or kill the firstborn of Egypt or, just insert whatever other emotional thing in there. It's like, whatever.
It's not just about salvation from hell. There's salvation from other things. And so we do believe that babies need God's grace. They need salvation. We just don't maybe believe it. They need to be saved from the guilt of what Adam did. And there'd be a difference.
And I don't even think I think that's one of the most inconsistent answers that I've ever heard. It's not about necessarily inherited guilt, right? All we're saying is that everyone is a sinner guilty of sin, even personal sin, right? Death spread to all men, Romans 5. Death spread to all men because all sinned. So if children are dying, maybe it's because they sinned and they're not innocent. Whether you want to view that as inherited guilt or just view that as God views them as having fallen in Adam, them as having fallen in Adam, however you want to view it is, in my opinion, sort of irrelevant to the ultimate question that is not being answered. And that is, why does God inflict these sorts of things, cursings, pains, suffering on innocent people?
But I know when it comes to the issue of fairness,
now listen to this. This question from Keith it's a very good question.
I think that what I said is true, and I would like to hear.
And spoiler alert, Leighton's not going to answer it. And I hope Leighton hears this, takes a little bit of notes, because these are the types of questions that we've been going through here. All these questions and more, but all these questions I will be asking him on the open panel discussion provisionism. So he's not answering them here. I hope he's ready to answer them there.
Your thought when I say that there's a sense in which there isn't really any unilateral fairness in the world, because even being born in America, there's
life's
a sense
not fair generally.
And a while back, you and I were in a Twitter back and forth with a guy who was arguing about whether or not somebody who never hears the gospel, they can still be saved. And that's not, I want to go there right now, because I know we may disagree on.
No, this is important, because he's about to ask a question that is it's past this point. So we've heard Leighton sort of address, can people who've never heard the gospel be saved, etc. Listen to Keith's question, because it's past the point. It's assuming they've heard the gospel.
Some of that. But the issue, though, was the issue of, okay, what if a guy only hears it once? Right? Versus a person who is literally drugged to church every day of their life for 18 years. And so is there not a sense in which that is unfair?
That is an absolutely fantastic question. Because again, from a humanistic standpoint, nobody's charging God with being unfair or unjust. But from our standpoint, doesn't it seem pretty obvious? How is it fair that one guy hears the gospel once, maybe he was having a bad day. I think I mentioned this in episode 1 as an example, now that I think about it. He's having a bad day, he rejects the gospel, and goes on to perish, die for eternity, whereas another guy hears the gospel because he's drugged to church every single week his entire life, and finally he accepts it because it's just, overcomes him or whatever after so many times. How is that fair? That's the question. So it's not, can people who've never heard be saved? It's when it comes to people who have heard within that category, how is it fair that some hear it more than others? Excellent question. Listen to whether or not we get an answer.
If we're simply trying to say God's not fair, and the atheist says that, right? Well, if God was all powerful, he'd be all good, and if he's not all good, he's not all. You've heard that argument. You're an evangelist, so you've heard all those apologetic arguments. So and I guess just your thoughts.
Well, there's been many books and papers and articles and broadcasts produced.
I wish Leighton does this so much, and I just wish, this is a pro tip to Leighton if he hears this. You have to stop, when you're in the hot seat like this, and like you will be in the open panel discussion that hopefully I will be participating in. When you're in the hot seat and people are asking you what you believe, you really need to stop ushering people over to the all-you-can-eat non-Calvinist buffet. You really need to stop presenting all these quote-unquote possible views and give your view. Please.
Answering those kinds of questions from both perspectives with regard to the unevangelized and
now, again, we're not talking about the unevangelized. We're talking about the people who have been evangelized. How is it fair that someone gets it once and someone gets it 100,000 times or whatever?
The quote-unquote justice or fairness of God, he does not show partiality, and all the emphasis with Romans 1 especially, that no one has an excuse because he's made himself abundantly clear through revelation.
None of this is an answer.
Conscience that we all have. I know William Lane Craig from a Molinist perspective.
And I'm pausing it here because he's about to start talking about molinism as if that even, Notice, no answer. And I also want to say that this ties into the fairness of what I asked earlier. How is it fair that God could have created me in a different life, but he gave me this life? Right? How's that fair? It's the same sort of question that I would just really, really like to get an answer to. And look, here's the thing. Giving the benefit of the doubt, sort of trying to, there is an answer to that question, right? The answer is, even though we might think it's unfair, it's not for God, because he's in the ultimate position. He's the creator who has the right to do things in these ways, right? And whether somebody hears the gospel once or 100,000 times, it's not unjust. It's not unfair. That's the answer. But here's the problem. If you give that answer, or in the case of my question, it's not unfair for God to create you in this life rather than that life because that's just him in his ultimate position, and he has the right to give you whichever life he wants, even though he's not checking with you first. If you give that answer, then you're just giving the Calvinist answer. Calvinist answer is that God has the right to do these things these ways. He's in the ultimate position. That's our answer. And so by answering that question and giving that answer, you forfeit the debate on so many issues, whether you realize it or not. So now we're going to start talking about molinism a little bit.
Dib argues that God makes himself sufficiently known to anybody he knows would respond positively. So there's a philosophical way. He admits, I think, I don't put words in his mouth. He can speak for himself, obviously, very well. But I think he talks about actualizing a world in which anyone who would respond positively has the opportunity to respond positively because God knows all possible worlds or all possible ways.
So what he's hinting at here is, I believe the phrase is trans world damned. Not all Molinists hold this view, but it's basically the view that there are certain people who, no matter how God creates, they will never accept the gospel. And some will even go so far as to say, based upon that knowledge, that those are the people that he creates off in the far reaches of the earth who don't ever hear the gospel. Because it helps them sort of reconcile this fact that, well, at least they didn't hear the gospel, sure, but at least even if they had, they never would have accepted it. So it just sort of makes them feel better. Now, I don't know, there's such a massive issue with that idea of Molinism in the first place. The general idea that you are this pre-existent thing that God can consider and consider how he's going to plug into these various situations, or in the case of I brought up earlier, lives, right? You got a million different lives. So here I am, Colin, and God can take Colin and consider putting him in a million different lives, and a million different results are made possible or brought into his knowledge, so to speak. The problem with that is it is ignoring, once again, God's ultimate role in the very creation of the person. So I would actually argue that if you stop and think about it, God can't take Colin out of this life and have hypothetically, I've created him in a different life. Because if he creates me differently, I am now a different person altogether, right? That would be, as a determinist, as a Calvinist, that would be how I understand God's creation. So although I raised that as an objection to the non-Calvinists when I started talking about, well, he could have created me in this way, that way, and the other way, and I would have had different lives, that's going with their assumption that you're just sort of this thing that God can consider plugging in different things to begin with. But as a Calvinist, I don't believe that. If God created me differently, I'd be a different person, right? I used to argue and have a little bit of fun with people and say, look, if God had created you in Hitler's place, would you have been as bad as Hitler? What's your answer to that question? Think it through. If God had created you in Hitler's place, would you have been as bad as Hitler? Now, most people instinctively, and you got to be careful, most people instinctively would want to say, oh, well, no, I would never be as bad as Hitler. He was terrible. Well, number one, upon what basis do you say that? Why are you less of a fallen sinner than Hitler, so to speak? If you were put in the exact same place as Hitler, with the exact same parents, exact same genetics, exact same, oh, wait a minute, now it's starting to sound like you would be Hitler. It's not just that you do as bad as Hitler did, you would actually be him, because God's creation of people, his creation of people defines who and what they are. That's how deep this goes. And that's how much I believe, no offense to the Molinist, I respect them for trying to take things seriously, trying to be logical, but where Molinism goes wrong, and it all comes back down to the grounding objection and something they don't even think is a problem, but we've talked about it before. God can't know anything about you unless he first considers creating you, when, where, and how he does. God's knowledge regarding you must be grounded in his having created, being your creator, in other words, right? He doesn't just look over at things that somebody else created and knows things about them, right? God doesn't know things about things he has nothing to do with. God knows things about things that he is creating in specific ways. Long story short. That was a massive squirrel. I don't even know if I don't know, but it's important.
In which somebody would respond. Again,
I know you're not necessarily defending that, but doesn't just you and I talking? Nobody's listening except for
So we just got a bunch of things that Leighton doesn't believe in an answer to the question of what Leighton does believe. That proves my point, guys. Leighton, you gotta stop that. Okay. I mean, just imagine. Here I am, Consistent Calvinism podcast, responding primarily to Leighton Flowers. Most of my episodes respond to him. Just imagine if I fire up, because almost all Leighton's videos are on the attack, Calvinism. So I fire up a video of Leighton's, and every time he asks me, me, not me personally, but me, the Calvinist, anytime he asks me a question, I go, well, Leighton, this guy over here says this, and that guy over there says that. And there's all these possible views out there. So there you go. It's like, what? No, I wanted you to defend Calvinism, right? Which is what I've done with my podcast. So Leighton, when you're in the hot seat, defend provisionism, man. Don't start talking about Molinism.
People. But you and I talking, doesn't that just take a step back, though, to the idea of isn't Molinism just another form of determinism? Because God is still determining to make this world where that happens.
Right.
Exactly. Back to the bullet bill example. You can shout free will, wave that free will magic wand, give that bullet bill free will all day long. But if I know before I pull that trigger exactly what it's going to do, then by pulling that trigger in that way at that time, I am determining each and every quote-unquote free will decision of that bullet bill all along the way. I've determined it because I created the gun, I created the bullet, I gave the bullet free will, knew everything would happen. I ultimately pulled the trigger. And that's what Molinism is stuck with.
It's a deterministic framework, but with the caveat of allowing for libertarian freedom. So God knows what someone will libertarianly freely do. He is not determining what they will do. And so, and choosing, and the big philosophical question, and some Molinists take different views on whether God is actively choosing to actualize a particular world at some point in time, whatever that means, depending on.
Now, I don't know what is going on right now. I just wanted to, before it gets out of my head and this little clip here, God is determining what they do, even in Molinism, as I just said. Okay, so people like to say knowledge is not causal, right? Just because I knew what the bullet would do doesn't mean I caused the bullet to do what it did. But that's only if I wasn't the one pulling the trigger. That's only if somebody else was firing the gun. And I just happen to know that if this person over there that I have nothing to do with fires the gun, then the bullet bill will do X, Y, and Z and go into someone's face and kill them. Well, then I can say all day long that I foreknew it, I didn't cause it, I've got nothing to do with it, right? But what's the problem with that? That's not what we have when we are considering God as the creator of all things and all people. God is the one pulling the trigger, okay? So nobody is saying, literally 0 people have ever said that God's knowledge is causing things. What we're saying is that God has knowledge of what he himself will cause by pulling the trigger. That's what we're saying.
On your theory of time.
Yeah,
and this is what it gets into.
Roll the dice,
Yes,
deal the cards.
We've got 2 philosophically trained.
I'm not a philosopher. I would like to think I'm a pastor and an exegete. At least that would be my.
So we are both diving into philosophical waters, and whether it's the molinist or the determinist, even the dynamic guys, open theist, even C.S. Lewis kind of takes more of the God's outside of time approach, kind of a Boethian, form of the view. And so,
1 second. Do we need to leave,
So what's Leighton's view?
brother? If you
It's like 5 minutes now.
okay, just be a few more minutes. I just don't want to. I don't want to hold you up. Okay, thank you.
So in other words, what I'm trying to present is that there are a number of different ways to answer a philosophical question.
Which one? What's your answer, Leighton? So all those views you just gave, which one do you like the most? Can you tell us?
I don't hold to, obviously, determinism in the.
And here we have theology by negation. So here's all these views. I'm not going to tell you which one I like, but what I don't like is determinism.
Fact that ultimately God's the one who's deciding what we will decide, and because I think that would be demonstrably unfair.
Okay, and I know this episode's getting long. Haven't done one in a while. You guys have to deal with it. It's unfair if God decides what I decide, is what we just heard Leighton say. And yet, I've just demonstrated with multiple examples that God, even in your view, Leighton, decides what you will decide. He decides to create you in exactly the way he does, knowing what you will decide. And he could have created you differently so that you'd be deciding different things. So you're deciding, you do a lot of deciding, but you didn't decide to be doing that deciding. God did. You see the point there? You see how you have to have God in the transcendent position, and you can't just bring him, either him down to your level or you up to his level, right? You have to have God in the ultimate position. And so as a determinist, I would say absolutely God chooses your choices. You make choices all the time, but you didn't choose to be making those choices, right? I have all sorts of things that are up to me in my life, but those things being up to me was not up to me. It was up to God. You see, there's 2 layers there. There's an ultimate layer and a time-bound creation storyline layer.
For God to decide what you will decide and then hold you accountable for what you decide, I do believe that's markedly unfair. In other words, I don't believe that it's fair.
If God knows that by creating me in situation A, I will decide A, and if he creates me in situation B, I will decide B, and it's up to God whether I am existing in situation A or B, and thereby deciding A or B, how is that not God deciding what I decide? Can you answer that question?
For God to ultimately be the ultimate cause of your decision and then hold you accountable for your decisions, which is one of the reasons.
See, and that little phrase sounds great, but there's so much baked into that we've covered in past episodes. God is not the ultimate cause of your decision. I'll say this nicely. This is my opinion. That's a blasphemous thing to say in terms of you're a creature. God created you. He's the ultimate cause of your existence. He's the ultimate cause of you having free will. I mean, he gave you free will. If I gave someone a tool and I knew that if I give this person a tool, they're going to take it and kill somebody, and I give them the tool anyways, how have I not caused them to take that tool and go kill? If I hadn't given them the tool, it never would have happened. If God hadn't created, none of it would be happening. How can you possibly get out of God being the ultimate cause, metaphysically speaking? I want to know that. And all you'll ever get is free will magic wand, and maybe even more than that. You might actually get what we had Leighton on record saying, that we create our choices out of nothing. You might get what we have revisionist perspective on record as saying, that you are the first mover of your movements or something like that. You're the first cause of, I'm the first cause. It's like only an eternal being can be the first metaphysical cause of something, right? You're not eternal. You're not eternal. And it's not just, as I pointed out before, that God caused you to come into existence and then after that, whatever. It's God caused you to come into existence, and God continues to cause your existence by upholding your existence. Hebrews 1:3, Colossians 1:17.
I defend my view of libertarian freedom with regard to the choices of man, the morally accountable choices of man. I'm not saying every single choice is like necessarily a libertarianly free choice, but when I say libertarian freedom, for those that may be listening, it's source freedom. In other words, that you are ultimately responsible for your choice, meaning that the source of the choice, the source of the desire, is within your control, not something God determines.
Well, Soros said libertarianism, if I'm not mistaken, I think what he's trying to say is what I just said, that you are the actual first metaphysical cause. That, you might as well just say you create your choices out of nothing. That's basically what Soros said libertarianism is, if I remember correctly.
Because on compatibilism, God determines your nature, which will ultimately decide your choice. So you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, God creates you in specific ways, specific parents, genetics, etc. Nature, yes. And that determines all sorts of things along the way. There's no question about that.
Freely, and therefore you're considered responsible and accountable on compatibilism. I just don't think that's a sufficient basis on which to hold somebody accountable if they're ultimately not able to control their nature to the degree that they can make a libertarianly free choice one way or the other with regard to the gospel and those kind of things.
Your thoughts on the you didn't get to hear my
and I don't know how you could ever argue that you control your nature. Sounds nice to a free will person, I assume, but can you articulate how that works in real life? I've heard Leighton, he doesn't want to say you choose your desires, but he wants to sort of say that your desires don't determine your choice. You choose which desire to act on. I think he's about to get into that.
I didn't. Sorry about that.
It's
some travel. Some travel situations. I was actually aiming to be here.
I mentioned that the Lutheran perspective, again, not hashtag you're Lutheran, but the Lutheran perspective of man is free in everything that is beneath him, but not free in those things which are above him. That is a phrase that they use, and I'm sympathetic to that. I understand what they're saying. They're trying. I think in a way, Edwards sort of tried to make that same argument with his understanding of the freedom of the will, that man has a free will to do those things that he desires to do. Problem is the things that are above him are beyond his desires, right? That would be my understanding of Edwards, at least in regard to his trying to express that man does make legitimate choices, and those choices are free choices in the sense that he's free to do what he wants to do. The problem is his want is what is.
His want is broken.
Yeah,
Squirrel talks about this. His want is born broken.
Yeah. I said this in a sermon recently. I said God gave me a new want. The want.
Yeah, and we can square that with fallen nature. I would be curious to see how Leighton squares desires with a nature inclined towards sin. Does an inclination deal with desires? And if you will certainly sin because of your nature inclined towards sin, how's that fair?
Right. So in that regard, I think that that would be and I'm sure you have 1,000 thoughts on that you'd want to say, but what are your thoughts when someone says, well, things that are beneath me, or when I say beneath me, you understand, the things that are
within your control,
within my control. I have
right. Well, I just happen to think that it's within your control to accept or reject the gospel.
Okay.
And so the fact that Calvinists don't is where we disagree.
Is there anything outside of?
Well, again, depends. We have control over things, but God is in control ultimately of our control. Our control is part of creation, and so when you say, well, I believe that we're in control of accepting or rejecting the gospel, it's like, well, everybody believes that. We believe that you can either accept or reject the gospel. It's just that everybody wants to reject the gospel by nature of being a sinner. That's what we want to do freely. We freely reject the gospel until God changes our heart.
Of my control.
Well, sure, you can't start flapping your arms and flying.
Okay, let me back up.
But say that flapping your wings and flying, you can't fly even if you wanted to. And I have to just say, go check out our other episodes. Because when we start getting into this, I could go on and on and on and on. We've covered those things before. Look up influences and determinism versus free will, and look up moral ability, an ontology, a response to Leighton Flowers.
And again, I don't want people to say my tone sounded as if I was being debating, and I'm not. But okay, so you and I think would both agree that it is beyond my control to, from this moment on, never sin again.
Oh, by the way, Leighton. You want to know something that's outside of your control? Your existing. That was God's control. And where you exist, how you exist, at what time you exist, what parents you get, your genetics, and countless other things regarding your life. Hunger, pain. There are all sorts of things that, although outside of your control, have a direct influence, impact, and I would say determinative relationship to the choices that you make throughout your life.
Well, again,
And it's kind of funny because earlier he wants to say, well, we've got a nature inclined towards sin and we're born into a sinful world. And for that reason, we will certainly sin someday. And as I pointed out before, that only makes sense if determinism is true. Okay? Because if you've got actual free will, then nothing says you must sin in the future. Nothing, like, that's a violation of free will. That's an affirmation of determinism to connect your future choices to your nature. That's determinism.
what would you consider logically possible versus feasible? And
we had this conversation. They didn't get to hear us have this conversation.
And I can go over it again if you want me to, but it kind of goes down the line of some of the philosophical issues of if any moment of sin from this point forward, you leave this place, and let's say you're stopped by a police officer and you're tempted to lie to him in order to get out of the ticket or not to lie. Do you have the free choice as a Christian to say yes or no? And I think most people generally would say, yeah, you could lie or not lie. Well, that would be a choice of libertarian freedom. Now,
Again, that's just choice in general. You're assuming libertarian freedom into that when you just say, well, you can make a choice to lie or not lie. Everybody believes that. The question is, why did you lie or why didn't you lie in that situation? And as soon as you start answering the why question, you're admitting determinism. As soon as you say, I did something because of X, Y, and Z, the root word of because is cause, and the definition of reason inherently has the word cause in it. Cause, justification, or explanation for an action or event. You give a reason that you did something, you are giving the cause behind the effect.
To do that with every single temptation you have from now until the end of your life, you could go to each one of those and say, well, yes, it's logically possible that you're going to make the right decision in any given moment. Is it feasible to suggest that a sinful person with sinful desire...
Now, I hate when they start talking about, oh, logically possible but not feasible. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. I think it's like word salad to cover up a glaring inconsistency. He just admitted that at every point of a decision of your life, you've got free will. You can either do or not do it. You could either choose A or B, all the way down the line. Well, if you're going to extrapolate that all the way down the line, then you don't get to come along and say, oh, but by the way, it's not feasible that you will always not sin. If free will were true, then you would have to have the hypothetical possibility of a perfect person who never sins. Right? And just to say it's not feasible, why isn't it feasible? Listen to the answer.
The right decision in any given moment. Is it feasible to suggest that a sinful person with sinful desires in a fallen world with dozens of temptations hitting them every hour of the day with thoughts and attitudes and hearts that you would never, ever, ever, ever sin again? No, it's not feasible that would happen. Is it logically possible? Yes, you can make that argument because at every point of temptation, the person, I would think a born-again person...
It's logically possible, but not feasible. Why? Because of all the reasons you listed off, temptation, desire, nature, like, that's all determinative language, dude. That's you explaining the reason why at that one point in time you deviated and did something different. It's because of all these reasons, right? If free will were true, those reasons wouldn't matter. They're irrelevant. Now you have to talk about them because they exist and we know them to be true. But it's a complete contradiction to your entire worldview. And I love that just such a simple question can bring down this sort of meltdown in the logical consistency of a position. Well, if libertarian's free will is true, why has there never been a sinless human? And this is the type of answer that you get. Total inconsistency. Well, yeah, they could be sinlessly perfect, but it's never happened because of all these non-determinative reasons? Anyway.
I see the nature or desires as influential, not determinative. So, for example, I love cake. I love the taste of cake.
What's cake? Yeah, right. Yeah.
By the way, your joke about the beard.
I might double check. Yeah,
that's hilarious.
Now, again, I covered cake as an example in my episode Influences and Determinism versus Free Will. Go check that episode out. I'm not going to rehash that here. Long story short, if you chose... Let's hear this.
I have self-deprecating humor.
Well, Jeff said, I have a beard because they were talking about, well, the Calvinists have a beard. He goes, I don't have a beard because I'm a Calvinist. I have a beard because I have no chin.
And I said, I have one because I have two.
That's hilarious. That got the crowd rolling. Anyway, what were we talking about? Oh, nature. Okay, so desires. Mm-hmm. I don't think desires are determinative. I think the agent is the determiner. Desires influence the agent. Mm-hmm. And so I have a desire.
And covered in the episode, I recommend you check out, but he's got the cart before the horse here. He's got it completely backwards. You act on your desires. Your desire determines your choice. You do something because you want desire. You want to be doing it. You don't choose to want to be doing it. That puts the cart before the horse.
To eat cake, I also have desire to lose weight. Okay, both of those are competing desires.
Okay, they're competing desires. And yet in each specific circumstance, one of those desires wins and is the greatest. Why? Unless you're going to, this is what's weird. They're competing, but which one's the winner and why? Leighton can't talk about one as the winner. He just says, well, they're over there competing, but my free will chooses the winner, right? I've got all these desires, I guess, instead of, this is my problem with his view, is he has the, instead of desires being inside you, like as your center, and from those desires comes your choices, he has your free will sort of surrounded by desires and looks around and goes, oh, today I'll go with this desire. And tomorrow maybe I'll go with that desire. And he talks about them as competing because we all know they are, but he never explains why one wins. You see, if there's a competition and desires are competing, there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a reason that it's the winner. But if you just say it's the winner because your free will chose it to be the winner, that's so backwards, it's hard to even wrap your head around it, right? Because that literally is saying you chose to want to choose. You chose the desire to then choose according to, right? Acting according to your desires is fine to say, in my view. I'm fine with saying that. But what Leighton says is he puts another layer of choice before that. And he says you choose which desire to choose according to. And that's where the cart comes before the horse. This also introduces the infinite regress I've talked about before. Why did you make that choice? Because you wanted to. Why did you want to? Because you chose to want to. Why did you choose to want to? Because you wanted to choose to want to. It just keeps going on forever. Because they try to keep free will in control.
If I choose to eat cake because it tastes so good, that doesn't mean the taste of cake determined my choice to eat. I chose to eat based upon that desire. If I choose the other direction, which I could and should, especially...
You chose to eat based upon the desire. If you say you chose to eat the cake because it tasted so good, you're giving the reason behind your choice. The taste of cake did cause you to eat the cake in that circumstance. Yes, it did. That doesn't mean that every time cake crosses your path, you will always eat it. But it does mean that in certain circumstances, your desire for the taste of cake was greater than your desire to lose weight. Right? And you just have to ask why in one circumstance was it the greatest, and in another circumstance, not the greatest. You got to ask those why questions. You got to answer the why questions. And by answering them, you admit determinism. You lose the free will debate.
My wife's around, I'm more likely to because she's my accountability partner when it comes to me eating correctly. Then I may make a choice based upon that desire. But
again, see how he says that? I just might. Who knows? It might happen this way or that way. He can't answer the why question. And he's hurt, he can't answer the why question. He's smart enough to know that if he answers the why question, he loses it. Determinism's true and he loses the debate.
Desire is influential. So I'm not making a choice without reasons. I have a reason. I ate the cake because it tastes so good. I ate the cake because I really love cake. I was really, really hungry. There's a lot of those desires.
Yeah.
But desires aren't determinate.
And in that instance, you are giving the greatest desire and the reason behind your choice. If you freely acted, then you acted on your greatest desire. To act according to a less than greatest desire would be force. It'd be not free. The freest choice you can be making, the freest action you can be taking, is acting according to the greatest desire at the time and the circumstance. So if your greatest desire was to eat the cake, but you didn't eat the cake, then you weren't acting freely, by definition. And if you say, well, I didn't eat the cake because I wanted to lose weight, well, if you were acting freely, then your greatest desire was to lose weight. Your desire to lose weight was greater than eating the cake. That's why you chose not to eat it. It's really simple. And everyday life, guys. Everyday life. Just think back over your choices, why you did what you did, and you'll see all this is true.
And when a Calvinist argues that we make a choice based upon our greatest desire, they turn desire from an influence into a determinative factor. That it ultimately determines the agent to make the choice, which I think reduces humanity to animal instinctive reflexes, where the lion chooses to eat meat instead of a bale of hay because it's his greatest desire.
Well, again, the reason our choices are not instinctive, by the way, a lot of our choices are. So when Leighton says this, I just have to stop and go, whoa, time out. Many, many, many of our choices are instinctive when you stop and think about it. Very few, actually, very few of our choices and actions and thoughts even are really sort of thought process and deliberation. They happen. They happen a lot. But to just say that just all our choices are, none of them are instinctive, and because we're human, my point is the difference between an instinctive animal and us is intelligence and thought process and deliberation. That's the difference. But it's no less determinative. Okay? As I've said before, you couldn't even think in a straight line if determinism weren't true. If you didn't have one thought leading to the next thought leading to the next thought, you couldn't even think. The process of thought would not be possible without determinism. Okay?
Well, of course, it's his greatest desire because he's an instinctive being, an instinctive creature that is always going
Now, him being an instinctive creature has nothing to do with whether or not it's his greatest desire.
to choose meat over grass. The cow, however, walks up.
And by the way, lions and dogs and animals sometimes will choose grass over meat. Right? Dogs will eat grass because they're feeling sick and they need to eat something that will cause them to throw up what is bothering their stomach. So even dogs, at certain times, their greatest desire won't be the meat. It'll be the grass. But notice something. That's because determinism is true. That's because there's something going on. There's something different about the situation. They feel sick. They want to not feel sick. And so they do something out of the ordinary even, which proves that there are determinative reasons behind what is going on.
To the same pile of meat and the pile of hay, and he chooses the hay instinctively, not as a moral choice. And that's the difference, is we're not making choices just based.
And I don't have any argument that the difference between a moral choice and an instinctive choice is the idea of thought process and deliberation. That's fine. I'm just saying they're no less determinative. Leighton is saying it's literally instinct is determinism, but moral choice isn't. And I'm saying no way, not even close. You're just assuming something that you're not proving.
Upon our instinctive God-given desire at the moment of choice. We are making moral decisions as human beings, weighing our options. But the cause of a choice is...
Right, so you weigh options. You deliberate over things. But notice something. Everybody deliberates in different ways at different times and for different reasons. So you might deliberate one way today, and tomorrow in a similar but not the same situation, you deliberate another way. Why? What's different? Why is it a different situation? Because maybe you've already been in a similar situation, so you've learned from your past experience, and it causes you to think differently the next time. You see? This could go on and on and on. The idea of choice is one of the most complicated things, and you could give a billion different examples, but guys, at the end of the day, I hope it's clear that determinism is in play here, and it's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean you're not making moral choices, doesn't mean you're an animal, it doesn't mean you're not responsible. These are all assumptions that Leighton makes.
Is the chooser. The cause of determination is the determiner. We are choice makers. God made us choice makers. He made us determiners. We determine our own choices.
And every determinist who's ever lived can say what you just said. We determine our choices. We make determinations and we make choices. There's just reasons behind why we made those determinations. There's reasons behind why we made those choices. There are things that are more ultimate than us because we're finite creations. All right, so that went way longer than I thought it would. I rambled a lot. Lots of squirrels were seen but not shot. And so, yeah. Go ahead and let me know in the comments what you think. I know this, it's actually nighttime, so there's 2 lamps I've got in my room. I tried to do some lighting. I've got a green screen, but you can still sort of see the haziness because of the lighting. I hope it looks decent, whatever. Let me know in the comments any recommendations. Maybe you want me to be bigger and what I'm playing to be smaller. I think this is really pretty good so far. I don't think there's going to be a lot of disagreement with that, but I'm open to any and all opinions. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Lots of rambling. Sorry about that, but hey, it's some content, something for you guys to chew on for a little bit. My next episode is going to be covering something Leighton reviewed. He reviewed some Calvinist dude talking to an atheist lady, and let's just say there's a lot of really good content to be responding to in that. So that's going to be our next target. With that said, hope you guys take it easy. You can find Consistent Calvinism Podcast on YouTube, all your favorite podcasting apps. Follow the Twitter at the letter C Calvinism, at C Calvinism, for a lot of fun discussions there as well. And remember to stay consistent, my friends.